In this lecture, we'll analyze how inflation can affect the income distribution in an economy. Now, high inflation can affect income distribution in various different groups of people, or people with different various socioeconomic backgrounds. So we're going to look at each of these groups one by one. So let's firstly look at how high inflation can affect the purchasing power of fixed income earners. And fixed income earners are those who are retired, who earn a superannuation of a fixed kind. So let's say these are retirees, or those with less bargaining power, or low bargaining. And this is possibly because their skills are low, or because their job is very common. So say McDonald's workers, they require low skill, and a lot of people are in demand for that job. So they have no bargaining power as to their wage. So let's say the income of these people are at $50,000 a year, which is a reasonable standard of living, and assuming that now inflation is 0%. But assume that inflation rises to 10%. Initially, that could buy $50,000 worth of goods. But now, if you divide this by 1 plus 0.1, they can now only buy 50,000 over 1.1, because 10% you convert that back into a decimal, and this represents the future value of money. And so 1 plus 0.1, so 50,000 divided by 1.1 should equal around 45,454.5. So that they're going to earn around, or be able to purchase around $45,000 worth of goods and services with the same money, because inflation has risen, and therefore the general prices has risen. So therefore their living standards have actually decreased. And I'll just put a red arrow next to this downwards. And this is just going to be bad. Okay. So the purchasing power of fixed income earners, so retirees or those with low bargaining power, would decrease because the time value of money decreases as inflation decreases. So we discount it from future years, and we discount it by 0.1 or 10%, and then we get the present value of the future income cash flow, which is only $45,454. And so now we can see that the purchasing power of those on fixed incomes would also decrease. Now we're going to look at exporters now. The fixed incomes of exporters would also decrease because, as we talked about in the previous lecture, our international competitiveness declines. And when this declines, our profits, or the profits of exporters, also decline. And therefore that would lead to an increase in structural or cyclical unemployment, because certain jobs will be made redundant because exporters try to cut costs and therefore reduce their labor resources. Okay, so now we can see that exporters would also be affected by a declining income. So that's not good for exporters. Thirdly, we have basic or ordinary households. And what ordinary households have is a mortgage. When they have a mortgage, if they have this on a fixed rate, then they're not going to be affected as much as when inflation increases. So we know that when inflation increases, the RBA would act to increase interest rates. So the RBA would increase interest rates. And this occurs due to certain aggregate demand policies, demand management policies, I should say. When they increase interest rates, they slow down consumption, and when they slow down consumption, inflation would be eased. But this is a topic that we'll talk about in monetary policy in more depth. But for now, just assume that when the RBA increases interest rates, inflation will tend to slow down. So, because a mortgage is either on a fixed or variable loan, so we know that households pay mortgages in installments or in annuities. So every month, let's say, for example, every quarter, every quarter or 2.5 months or 3 months, I should say, they pay a certain fixed rate of mortgage, and which encompasses the interest rates or the interest paid on the loans that they took out for the mortgage. So if the mortgage was taken out on a fixed cost, they wouldn't be affected by high inflation or an increase in the current rate of inflation or interest rate, because they'll be fixed on a previous interest rate prior to the change in inflation. So that wouldn't be affected so much. Instead, they would actually see a capital gain. We don't need to know about that. What you do need to know is that when there is a change in the variable rate, so when they are paying interest according to market changes, they're going to be affected by an increase in interest rates, because now they would experience a higher rate of repayment on their mortgage since interest rates have increased and they're paying on a variable or market rate. And so what happens is, now that housing affordability declines due to rising interest payments, this will take a higher proportion of their household income, especially if their purchasing power is very low due to fixed incomes. So that would decrease their discretionary income. So income after tax and interest. And so what happens now is that their purchasing power decrease and therefore experience a decrease in income. And as we can see all here, exporters will decrease, purchasing power will decrease, and also discretionary income will decrease. They all affect the aggregate demand equation. Let's rub out this part and we'll move on to the next example on how it also affects producers in the same sense. So now we know that producers act to seek to maximize their profits. And what they do is they believe they should invest when confidence is high. So naturally, we're assuming consumer sovereignty. When consumers demand more, then they're going to produce more. And to produce more, they're going to invest in capital or R&D. So efficiency improving practices. But now we can see that because aggregate demand is a component of all these factors that we talked about, because net exports have decreased, consumer expenditure or consumption has decreased as well due to a decrease in discretionary income. Businesses will be less likely to spend because aggregate demand has decreased. So what they're going to do is, because they want to maximize profits and because some investors are absolute return investors, they're not going to invest in this capital or R&D. So therefore, again, investment expenditure decreases. They're not going to invest in any productive investments, because that takes a while for them to actually return the profits, because it requires consumers to actually buy their product. So what they do is they invest in speculative options. So now, for example, if inflation were to rise by 10% and the interest rate paid is only 5%, they're going to be losing money when they put it into the bank. And they're not going to invest in capital or research and development because we can see that aggregate demand is slowing. And so they're not going to realize any profits from obtaining any capital or research and development. And so what this means is they're not going to put it into the bank. They're not going to just keep the money, in under their beds because that's going to return a 0% profit. They want to keep their purchasing power or maintain their purchasing power. And since inflation is only 10%, they're going to speculate in various sources of the speculative options. So these include securities, shares, bonds, and all these different speculative options. So futures as well, options. And let's say these portfolios return a 20% rate of return, but the risk involved in these shares, bonds, futures, options, and securities are also greater. So they could run the risk of actually losing money. But they assume that because they can only earn a guaranteed 5% on interest and 0% by just putting it underneath their bed, it is better to take a calculated risk of earning 20% rather than guarantee in losing money or losing purchasing power. So what happens is, because securities, shares, bonds, futures, and options aren't actually included in aggregate demand because they don't actually add to production, they're just pieces of paper that they buy, and in the future they might appreciate in value, investment expenditure would also go down, and therefore aggregate demand would also worsen. And so income distribution for companies would actually decrease. But what this also means is that those on high incomes, so high incomes, would also tend not to put their monies into the bank. So high income earners, so the already wealthy, they would also seek to invest in securities, shares, bonds. And therefore, quite possibly, the wealthy will become even wealthier because they can afford to take this calculated risk. Whereas people on mortgages, people on fixed incomes, they can't afford to take this risk because they need to meet their financial obligations. And so speculators who are already wealthy will have larger gains, will run the risk of making even larger gains than before. And so they could actually improve their living standards in this way. So as we can see, the consequences of high inflation doesn't actually decrease the purchasing power or the incomes of everybody. It's only for the exporters that they would require a decrease in their incomes or their purchasing power. Basic households who have mortgages on a variable rate, that would affect their purchasing power. And also investors or businesses or wealthy people who have the money, they're going to experience possibly an increase in their purchasing power. And so income distribution is moved away from those already less well off to those who are better off, and this would sort of exacerbate inequality in the nation, because those wealthy will become better off if they prove to find worthy or very profitable investments, but those who are on lower incomes would have to save more and would have to decrease their material living standards or compromise their material living standards as inflation rises and as their purchasing power decreases.